This video is brought to you by the good folks at KEH. Not only is KEH the oldest and biggest at what they do, buying and selling exclusively used camera gear of all sorts since 1979, but they do it well, with integrity and both a 180-day warranty and 21-day return policy, free shipping on transactions over $49. Which is why, because they make it as futz-free a process as possible, they are our go-to whenever we are looking to fund new purchases by selling our own gear or buying that special used piece of kit properly graded and checked when we want to go quirky or old school. Check them out using the special links and 5% discount or bonus code in the video description below. Thank you, KEH. A couple of weeks ago, as the first signs of spring began to appear, just about 2 years after Canon launched the EOS R5 and R6, both of which I considered to be the first cameras in the R lineup worthy of the RF lenses developed for them. Almost 4 years after the launch of the original R in 2018, which candidly I considered to be half-baked compared to Nikon's and Panasonic's full-frame mirrorless entries, never mind Sony's. And rather than rehash all of that, I encourage you to look at my videos on those cameras at the time. I'll put links to them down below. I thought to myself, maybe it's time for me to give the EOS R system another look. A quick email exchange with our friends at KEH, and shortly thereafter, a like-new, really, it looked and felt new, 45-megapixel full-frame R5, along with an equally pristine RF 24-105 f4L, arrived on our doorstep. A few days after that, I was out on the streets of New York with this kit and got images like this. Oh, baby. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for 3 Blind Men and an Elephant, and I'll just cut to the chase. I am very impressed with what I was able to get out of that R5 kit full stop. The camera's combination of performant high-resolution sensor, excellent 5.76 million UXGA viewfinder, class-leading IBIS, top-tier autofocus performance, solid build quality, solid weather sealing, class-leading touch menu implementation, and finally, these many years later, call it an adequate number of performant native RF mount lenses, like this 24-105 f4L, means it is a highly capable and usable camera system offering outstanding photographic capture potential. But impressive video specs, 2 years worth of firmware updates, and a much more fleshed out lens line notwithstanding, the R5 is far less compelling as a video capture tool for me. As in, not at all compelling, actually, which is why I'm not filming this segment with the R5. I estimate it will take me between 45 and 55 minutes worth of recording time to share with you today what I'd like, allowing for my particular cadence, flubbed lines, and retakes, but the R5 will stop recording no later than its 29-minute and 50-second limit. Quite possibly sooner, given a thermal management system simply not designed for the kind of long-form recording we do, YouTube videos and interviews. Of course, your mileage may vary, that's fine, and you may or may not care about video at all, I understand. It was only when I let go of the idea of evaluating the R5 as a do-it-all hybrid that I could really appreciate it for what it can do exceptionally well. Serve as a modern implementation of an old school idea of what a camera is, which is to say, not a movie camera. At least not for people who don't have the time to worry about when it's going to shut down on them. So let's get into it. First, I've just given you the bottom line, but here's a little more insight. I chose the R5 with that lens as a photography-only kit, which, by the way, sells as a kit new for $4,500, because it struck me that this is the configuration I'd buy were I to move to Canon, given A, the camera I already own and use for my personal street work is the similarly spec'd, at least from a resolution perspective, 47-megapixel Leica SL2, which I also only use for photography. B, the reality that Canon offers not a single, no optical compromise, moderately fast, moderately priced prime, let alone a set of such primes, which is my preferred approach and how I equip my SL2. And C, The camera we already own and use for our professional video work is a Sony A7 IV. I'm recording with it right now, a camera against which I already knew the R5 simply could not compete. Don't look at me in that tone of voice. Not on the basis of specs, mind you, nor on the basis of build quality, IBIS, menu system, touch interface, industrial design, feel in hand, ergonomics most of the time, or EVF either. The R5 handily beats the A7 IV on all of these counts. But instead, on the basis of just a few fairly mundane, though more important considerations where the A7 IV handily beats the R5. The first of which I've already mentioned. A, reliable video, that is, no recording limit, no overheating at 4K. Forget about 8K, because 4K is now the meat and potatoes resolution at which we capture and render. B, superior lens selection, because of Sony's decision early on to open its lens mount specification to third parties and the 5-year head start Sony also enjoys and still has on Canon. C, no futz approach to switching between stills and video, which, to be fair, is easy enough to overcome on the R5, even if it is so odd that it leaves me a little bit resentful every single time. We'll come back to this in a moment. D, a full-sized HDMI port, which for those of you who don't do video constantly sounds like an it, but believe me, this is a big deal when reliability is a must. And E, price, as in the fact that the A7 IV is a cool $1,400 less. What about the R5's 8K in particular, or the fact that it doesn't crop to APS-C like the Sony A7 IV does when shooting 4K 60p? Yeah, what about it? For 99% of us, 99% of the time, what difference does 8K make if virtually no one consumes it? Just about no one is asking for it. The processing and storage overheads are enormous. The notion of incurring those overheads for the sake of croppability makes far less sense for video than it does for, say, street photography, because filmmaking requires far more pre-production planning anyway, including shot lists and lens selection a priori. And the idea of future-proofing in a market segment where performance goes up and prices go down, relatively speaking, every 18 to 24 months or so is just silly. What difference does no crop 4K 60p make if you're going to be worrying about overheating or recording limit even then? Though, hey, if these are big differences to you, it's all good. Welcome to my world of being a statistical outlier. But second, straight up, yay, after a couple of hours on the street and then reviewing the images at magnification so high I'd rather put a fork in my eye, I'd say the R5 gives up just about nothing to my $7,000 Leica SL2 in the way of stills image quality at, right, closing in on half the price, while offering superior autofocus. Absolutely. Even if I still find the SL2 far more satisfying in hand, with superior build quality and, to my way of thinking, industrial design, the lenses that I really want. And the R5's autofocus advantage is somewhere between surprisingly small and utterly irrelevant for the kind of shooting I do. But say it with me now, hey, that's just me. And credit where credit is due, the R5 is a far superior value compared to my SL2. I'd say that the R5 is as good a photographer's tool as any other 45-ish megapixel full-frame camera out there, like, never mind marginal differences, which generally accrue to the benefit of Nikon's Z7 II, Panasonic's S1R, and Sony's A7 R3A, although the R5 is between $200 and $1,700 more expensive. And given the choice among these cameras, were we to buy new, we would opt for the $3,000 Z7 II, which, oh, by the way, we did. It is now Claudia's daily driver. We think the Z7 II is the best value and most satisfying camera system of this lot, with, as I just implied, a better selection of glass. Hold that thought. Third, with all of this said, I was going to spend a whole lot of time explaining to you why, when I first put the R5 up to my eye on the street, I found the physical controls maddeningly out of touch for a pure photographer. I was, for example, going to tell you that there is nary a dedicated physical ISO or shutter speed control to be found straight out of the box in manual mode, Interesting qualification, right? With the top rear control dial acting unlike any other cameras I've ever used. But after tinkering with the customization menus, I realized this need not be the case. And thinking about it for more than a minute or two, I realized the lack of dedicated physical controls is no different from my SL2 or CL. I think those cameras are great and even faster than cameras with more traditional controls. In fact, the R5's top mode dial and quick control dial could have been lifted directly from Leica's CL. So, right, customization. I was, for another example, going to tell you about how I set the top plate quick control dial to when in manual mode from the default of exposure compensation to shutter speed, unless that's just how it happened to come from KEH. How I set the rear quick control dial 1 to exposure compensation because I use that much less often, although I find that dial for any of the exposure triangle parameters still quite awkward, and how I set the top plate multifunction button so that ISO is the first thing that pops up when I tap it because I also use that much more often than any other setting save for shutter speed, aperture, and focus mode. And while I kept muttering to myself, only think of it as a stills camera, only think of it as a stills camera, I was going to say something like, yeah, but I dare you not to shake your head in amazement when you learn that the way to switch between video and stills requires you to first push that mode button and then push the info button, which is completely unrelated, and then access the quick control dial to surrounding the mode button to select the mode you want and then confirming your choice by pushing down on the mode button again. But to be fair, I was also going to tell you that the R5 is probably a better hybrid for most of us than its younger but more expensive brother, the more video-centric R5C, because the R5 doesn't give up IBIS. Amazingly, the R5C does, although maybe not so amazingly. The GH5S gave up the IBIS that the GH5 had. The R5 costs $600 less than the C. The R5 has fewer power management and data storage issues than the C, because at its highest resolution, frame rate, bit depth, and chroma sampling, the R5C will fill a 64GB card in 4 minutes, according to our friends Ev and Dave over at TCSTV, while being unable to supply power sufficient to drive either autofocus or iris control. And the regular R5 is smaller and lighter than the C because it doesn't have the active cooling that the C does. Although, that active cooling is why the R5C is a more buttoned-up video camera. It can record up to 4K 120p with ostensibly no limit or overheating issues, even if both R5 variants use a micro USB port. I was even going to tell you that the R5 offers things Canon's $5,500 dedicated Cinema EOS 70 doesn't, including but not limited to that full-frame high-resolution sensor capable of 8K recording. The C70 uses a 9.6-megapixel Super 35 sensor capable of recording up to, as I just mentioned, DCI 4K 120p, no 8K at all. B, IBIS, again. C, an integrated EVF. The C70 has none. D, a body 1/3 lighter at a cost, also as it turns out, about 1/3 lighter. And E, the R5 is just a much better stills camera. Not only because the C70 only has a 9.6 megapixel sensor, but because it's only capable of 12-bit capture. Although the C70 does have internal neutral density filters. Yeah, baby, yeah. A purported 16 stops of dynamic range when using who knows which C-Log. And a full-sized HDMI port, yay. Finally, within Canon's lineup, I was going to say that for all that, the R5's $1,400 less expensive, lower resolution, that is 20 megapixel stills, 4K only video, twin, the R6 would conversely probably be a better value for most of us, though it would still be essentially useless to people like me for video. Oh, I just did tell you. Fourth, and this is a big difference compared with where the R system was even 2 years ago. As I said at the outset, I think it's fair to say the RF lens catalog is now finally rounded out sufficiently for most Canonistas, or anyone else for that matter, irrespective of brand, that they can migrate from their legacy system to the mirrorless R system whole cloth without compromise. Much compromise. Save those of us who pine for no compromise, moderately fast and moderately priced primes, or lament the absence of Canon's canonical, get it, tilt and shift lenses. In addition to recreating and reconceptualizing much of Canon's prior EF lens catalog for RF mount, including holy trinity zooms like the 15 to 35, 24 to 70, and 70 to 200 2.8s, all in the $2,400 to $2,800 range, and long telephoto L primes for professional and well-heeled enthusiast sports and wildlife shooters. I'm talking 400, 600, 800, and 1200 millimeter lenses that cost between $12,000 and $20,000. Canon has also introduced novel new lenses like their sub-$1,000 100 to 400 5.628 and 600 and 800 millimeter f11s, and improved upon their canonical 50 and 85 1.2s. Although that's kind of it for interesting primes. Their sub-$600 budget STMs, the 16 2.8, 35 1.8 macro, 50 1.8, and 85 2 macro, are not designed to quicken the pulse of discerning non-telephoto prime shooters interested in spending less than $2,000 or $3,000 a pop. Unlike, say, Nikon's superb sub-$1,000 20, 24, 35, 50, and 85 1.8 Z primes, Sigma's excellent I series, their sub-$700 20, 24, 35, 45, 65, and 90 millimeter lenses, or Sony's surprisingly tasty and petite sub-$600 24 2.8, 42.5, and 52.5 G series primes. Although now that I think about it, I should also have mentioned that the RF version of the 800 5.6, as an example, costs a cool $6,000 more than the EF counterpart. So, okay, price is one compromise many of us would have to make, super telephoto or not. Now, for all that, some of us may argue that none of this matters, that adapting the enormous EF lens catalog, which has always had its share of truly outstanding glass, or adapting Nikon's legacy lens catalog, same commentary, has always been a viable option from the get-go. Maybe, for some of us, perhaps, but my perspective, now as at the beginning, is that autofocus performance with adapted glass is never as fast and sure as native glass, irrespective of manufacturer, irrespective of what my colleagues in the industry may say, and RF lens autofocus speed and silence and image quality, while we're at it, are generally superior to their Canon and Nikon legacy mount counterparts. As are, in fact, the latest mirrorless lenses from Sony, Panasonic, and Sigma, never mind Leica. All of which leaves us where precisely? I'll wrap it up this way. If you are a Canon fan, I'd tell you that the functional trajectories of Canon's RF lens line and RF camera bodies have finally intersected at the R5 in early 2022. If the RF catalog has the lenses you want at prices that work for you, the R5 will extract the maximum from them and you'll be happy. If you don't care about uber reliable video, or are at least not as twitchy as I am about overheating video recording limits, and don't mind the practically pasted on implementation of switching between stills and video. Which clearly makes it not the camera for me, but as always, your mileage may vary, and that's fine, truly. In the real world, I think it fair to assert that the R5 will be most appealing to the relatively pure photographers among us, doing everything from event photography to travel, street, portrait, fashion, photojournalism, and documentary photography, because they are the ones for whom the R5's pretty straightforward video weaknesses mean relatively little. Although again, the absence of compelling, moderately fast, moderately priced primes make it a bigger stretch for street and travel photographers in particular. If you feel the need for speed, either as a pro or well-heeled enthusiast sports or wildlife photographer, one can argue that the $6,000 24-megapixel R3 is the better tool. I understand. It is a reasonable position to take. Although, upon reflection, you may decide the loss of 21 megapixels and the increase in size and weight as you pony up an extra $2,200 may not be worth it. $2,100? B, it may make more sense for you to wait for the rumored APS-C 32-megapixel R7. Then again, in an era of supply chain chaos, you may be waiting longer than you might think or want. For video-centric shooters or true hybrid shooters, however, I think the R5's weaknesses I've already mentioned will more than offset the camera's bragging rights, AK spec. If you do prioritize video over stills, have the budget, and don't mind using a gimbal, the R5C is a better tool than the R5, except as I've already noted. Although I should add that the C does have dedicated stills and video menu subsystems, which is nice. If you don't really care about stills at all, the C70 is better yet. But if you prioritize glass over resolution and are more budget conscious, if you don't care about 8K, right, the R6 is arguably the best value of all within the Canon RF mount camera lineup. Although you'll still have recording limit and overheating issues no matter what anyone says about improvements via firmware. If you are comfortable, however, looking beyond Canon, there are better values, especially when you shop used, which is a beautiful segue as we close out for today with what you'll find by shopping over at KEH, because buying used is one way of getting past new camera and lens shortages, rapidly rising inflation, and because buying used gets very interesting, bordering on the occasional arbitrage opportunity. And yeah, it's good for the environment too. You can certainly save yourself some money, for example, on a like new R5 with KEH's 180-day warranty and 21-day return policy, ditto on Canon's 24-105 f4L. I have to send these back. Someone's going to get a great kit. It's actually easy for me to recommend both as the R starting kit for photographers. Though with those supply chain disruptions across the imaging industry being what they are, those savings are not nearly as significant as what you can find at what I think is the sweet spot in the used market, full-frame mirrorless cameras pre-2020. Like the 47-megapixel Lumix S1R I mentioned earlier, the S1R is actually a stellar camera for our kind of shooting with incredible build quality, great ergos and heat management, superior to the Canon, a fuller, better thought out functional suite, as good or better IBIS in fact, if not spec, and autofocus for stills every bit as performant as the R5's, save for sports and wildlife and okay spinning models, which I admit actually surprised me. I found very little difference in image quality in the real world between the R5 with the 24-105 and the Panasonic S1R with its 24-105, which I also happen to have with me. The thing of it is, while the difference in price between a new R5 and S1R is only a couple of $100, a used like new S1R is at least $1,500 less than a like new used R5, less expensive than a new R6, which is enough to cover a used or new for that matter 24-105 f4 from any of them with a couple of $100 to spare. Although, if video, autofocus, or sports and wildlife shooting are critical to you, right, you'll prefer the R5, no doubt about it. Or a Nikon Z7 II, which, as I've already said, we think is a better value than the R5, listing for $900 less new. Although, like the R5, I think used Z7 IIs, neither of which are pre-2020 models, are in especially high demand given current product shortages. Thus, a used OG, original gangster, Nikon Z7 at KEH is even less than a used S1R, and I think the Z7 is generally underrated as a photographer's tool, although I do like the autofocus better on the Z7 II. Which again, doesn't matter if you're not shooting sports, wildlife, spinning models, for the most part. But hey, while we're at it, especially if you're into video and still want to get really nice stills quality, don't overlook Fujifilm's APS-C X-T4 or even Panasonic's Micro Four Thirds GH5, nor Panasonic's full-frame Baby S1, the S5, any one of which can be had like new from KEH for under $1,500 and offer compelling and more affordable lens options for many of us. Then again, The last two lenses I bought from KEH were this little guy, one of my favorite lenses of all time, Leica's unsung, uber-performant, jewel-like Elmar M 24mm f3.8. And this little guy, Voigtlander's super wide Heliar 15mm f4.5 version 3, both for my M11. Go figure. A big shout out to KEH for sponsoring this video, a great resource for finding just this kind of gear. Check them out using the special links and 5% discount or bonus code in the video description below. Thank you, KEH. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below because this is an incredible audience. If you'd like a copy of our Streets of New York, the book, head over to www.3bmep.com/books. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one video session with me for a portfolio review, explore or hone your artistic voice, select gear, and more, sign up at www.3bmep.com/booking. Finally, consider supporting our work by using our no-cost-to-you affiliate links down below, picking up some official Three Blind Men and an Elephant swag at 3bmep.threadless.com, sending coffee money via PayPal, or best of all, join us as a patron over at Patreon. However you choose to support us, as always, we thank you for it.